Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are live tonight with Robin Moss, who is the Director of Strategy for the UJIA. For those of you who are expecting to see David Mintz tonight as well, he sends his apologies. He's not feeling 100% tonight, so he didn't think he could make it on to the actual broadcast. He's in the background helping me out with the comments and everything, so thank you, David, still for doing all that. Hello to Adam Patrick, as Adam Patrick always says hello to all of us and happy birthday to Israel 73. Absolutely, we're going to come back to that soon. But I'd like to introduce you to, as I said before, Robin Moss, Director of Strategy. So instead of me introducing you, Robin, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody that's here tonight?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Eisenberg. So I'm Robin. It's really a pleasure to join you in this strange way that we join each other now. I'm at home. I live in London. But it's really a pleasure to be virtually, at least, in Manchester. I'm the Director of Strategy for UJIA, which means I head our educational work in the UK. So me and the educators that we work with, we bring Israel to the UK, even at the moment as we can't go to Israel. And of course, this week is a very exciting and solemn, but also uplifting week for us.
So maybe let us into what the UJIA does. I know we have had many times we've had a techist here, and if I can remind people, actually, I don't know, David, if you have that in the background, David Mintz, the poster that we have from the UJIA, there is actually an event going on. Ben Shapiro had sent me the poster, and the shul has sent it out, as well as I've sent it out over my WhatsApp. So we will have a techist going on this week. So that's, I think, as far as I remember, it's on Tuesday night. So yeah, that is on Tuesday night. So maybe tell us some of the things that the UJIA does for Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaTzmaut, and then we'll move into your educational work that you do as well.
Sure, absolutely. It's obviously this week is really a pinnacle of activity for us. And normally before the pandemic, we'd have delegations coming over from Israel and we'd be in person and all this kind of thing. Obviously, we've had to adapt. And last year, obviously, the pandemic hit really only a month before all this was going on. So it was very much all hands to the pump to make sure we had anything. And actually, I don't know if you tuned in, the techist last year was incredibly moving. This year, obviously, we've had a bit more time to plan. So there's actually loads going on. If you have primary school age children, or indeed you work at a Jewish primary, we have a whole set of resources that many primary schools are going to be using to teach young people about Israel. We have done a tie-up with PJ Library, an amazing organization which sends books to 8,000 Jewish children across the UK, where with the book, you get a dice that you can create and a link to a website with all sorts of activities aimed at families. And then, of course, we have our two flagship events. We have on Tuesday evening, 7 till 8 p.m. I'll explain how you can find it in a sec, but 7 till 8 p.m. we have our TechS, centered, of course, and led by our Manchester team, but really one of the advantages of the digital world is we can invite the whole national Jewish community to join us. We have Chief Rabbi Mervis joining us. We have Anat Farkash, the mother of, sadly, her son Tom, of blessed memory, died in the Second Lebanon War in 2006, and others. And it will be a chance to remember and reflect upon the sacrifice of Israelis. And then 2 days later in the morning, on Thursday, the 15th, from 9 to about 9:45 in the morning, normally, again, we would gather for a business breakfast. Instead, we can just log on and really celebrate Israel over breakfast as Yom HaTzmaut kicks off. And in the theme of business, of course, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, one of the big stories of the last year, really a miracle, is the Abraham Accords, the opening up of diplomatic relations and normalization between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, and maybe those have gone from being enemies to neighbors now, possibly even to friends. And we have the two co-chairs of the Israel UAE Business Forum, an Israeli and an Emirati, who are going to talk a little bit about what this might mean for business. So there's loads going on. We hope that everyone can join in. If you go to ujia.org, you'll see in the top right-hand corner, there's a button you can click where you can get access to all of this and more. You can sign up to the various events. You can just join them on Facebook, YouTube, that kind of thing. But we're really looking forward to making this a memorable year for Yom HaTzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, even as we still have to be at home and can't sadly be in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, the more when I hear about you describing the Tekis, I've been going to the Tekis for many years. I would say now 8 years. Last year I didn't make it, and this year we won't, or maybe 9 years. For many years, it actually was at the Hilton Suite. I don't know. Have you ever been to the Hilton Suite when we had a Tekis by us here in Manchester, in our shul actually?
Sadly, I've never been to the Manchester Tekes, but as soon as we can travel again and it is in person, it is high on my list. I last year got to watch it, of course, online, but no, I've usually been to Tekes in London, but I would absolutely love to join you in Manchester when it's in person again.
I mean, the group that used to put it together, so Sally, who's now retiring from the UJIA, she sent me an email, but it was Sally Hallen who used to bring over, there was a group of students they used to bring over, and I always had the opportunity to meet them because they actually, the Hilton Suite is the hall that's connected to our shul. So actually I always had the opportunity to meet with the young teenagers and to speak to them. And it was interesting to hear how they come from sort of the north of Israel, from a more deprived area, and it was usually boys and girls that came over, and they had to, this whole thing was put together for them in English. So it really wasn't in their mother tongue. It was something they had to do in another language. They had to remember all of their lines, and more than once, I can remember not only 1 year, but many years, a lot of the participants got so emotional that they had to like stop, regroup, and start again. And I'm sure, you know, I don't know, what is it that you do in London? Do you do something similar like that? Do you also bring over a delegation?
So we hope, by the way, to restore the delegation next year. Please God, if it's possible.
When we can, absolutely.
We think it's very, very important for the Manchester community, and meeting these teenagers who themselves are just going to go into the army in just a few years, possibly a year or two. You know, it's very, very powerful. In London, it's a slightly more dispersed affair. There is no central Tekes, but there are all sorts of Tekesim. Also, by the way, for the Israeli community, I don't know if any of the people watching have ever been in Israel and been to an Israeli Tekes, which obviously has a very different feel. I would really encourage people, when we can travel again, be in Israel in this period at some point. It's really fascinating. Even don't worry about if you understand Hebrew or not. Go and experience Yom HaZikaron, and then the following night, the transition ceremony to Yom HaTzmaut. It's something, it's very hard to describe, but it's something very special. But me, normally, I'm either at my synagogue Tekes, or I have on a number of occasions joined the Israeli community in London, and to join and be there. I think it's about showing up as well as because, you know, I'm not Israeli. I haven't fought in the army, although many of my friends have. But I think it's really an important day, just as, by the way, I think Remembrance Sunday for our own country is an important day as well. Even though I, again, have not fought in the British Army, I think to remember the sacrifice of those who had is critical to what it is to be British, and in this case, what it is to be a Zionist.
Absolutely. And Yom HaZikaron is not only about the soldiers, actually. It's about all those people that have lost their lives in the establishment of the State of Israel, but also through terror attacks and other things. And I think as you go through Israel, I lived in Israel for 9 years. So everybody in Israel will have a neighbor, a cousin, a friend, or someone who lost their life. Isn't that so?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like that. Obviously, the first thing I should say, and is, you know, I'm not saying this to be kind of controversial to refute the point. It's important to understand, of course, that we say everybody serves. Of course, it's not the case that everybody serves. And there are many Israelis of good standing, either for disability reasons or because of their community or religious beliefs and so on, who don't serve. However, within the kind of mainstream of the Israeli Jewish society, certainly, it really does have that feel. And it's the thing that was really striking to me. I was living in Israel a few years ago, and at this period, and I joined a Tekes that was at a school. And I realized when I was growing up at my school, there was like a memorial to people who fought in the First and Second World War from my school. And it always was like tucked away in a corner, and it was important and it was well respected. And in November, you know, we did a ceremony there, but it was very far removed from me as a pupil in the 90s or the early noughties. Really, like nobody in the school community knew who these people were except for their names on the wall. In Israel, it's very different. Every school, certainly every mainstream Israeli Jewish school, will have alumni of its school who sadly died either fighting in combat or for other reasons in the army, or, as you say, as victims of terror. And these people live on through the new generations of the school. And this is not, in many cases, you know, 100 years ago. This might be much, much more recently. Just to give one other example, if you go to Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, one of the big hostels in the centre of Jerusalem, the head of the kind of emergency department, who actually was a British Ole, who very sadly died in a terror attack the night before his daughter's wedding. He took his
Dr. Applebaum, yes.
out for a drink in order to kind of have the last words as the father to the daughter, and sadly died caught up in a suicide attack in the Second Intifada. And there is a memorial to him right there as you enter. You know, for Israelis, these days are not solemn because someone tells them to be solemn. They're solemn because they're in their heart and in their minds, and many Israelis are thinking about particular people on these days. And just the last thing I'll say is, for these teenagers who come to the UK, again, sadly not last year or this year, but please God in the future, it's a hard experience being outside of Israel for native-born Israelis. You know, these are days when really Israeliness is very at its most visceral, and to be outside of Israel, as you say, some of them find it very emotional. And many of my Israeli friends say they love much about living in London or Manchester, but this week can be the hardest week of the year.
Amazing. You know, it's interesting. You mentioned Dr. Applebaum. It's actually interesting to note that his daughter, Nava Applebaum, who died with him over there in Emek Rephaim when they were out, her wedding dress has been, you know where her wedding dress is? Have you ever seen it? It's actually, you know, Kever Rachel, the tomb of Rachel in Bethlehem. So there they have on the women's section, they've actually taken that dress and around Rachel's tomb, they have that as a sort of a cover on where they say the tomb is. So it's a very, my wife told me when she's been, or other people said when they've been, they find it a very, very emotional sort of like, you know, here's a woman who gave away her husband, here's another woman who never made it to her wedding. And it's a connection almost of the past and the present of Judaism and really the struggle of us as a nation and as Jews to be able to maybe assert ourselves. So how do you get UK teenagers to understand or to maybe start to feel a little bit of what it means these days in Israel? You know, we live so far removed from it. How can we feel it?
So I think that for me, actually, the analogy with Remembrance Day is very important here. And I'm not just talking about the fact they both happen to be Remembrance Days. For many, you know, for many in British society, war feels so far away. And we have these ceremonies in November, and we stand and we buy our poppy. But for many people, it's hard to know what's going on inside. And this is not a criticism of people. You know, it's hard to experience something that you don't have first-hand experience of. And there have been substantial educational efforts and artistic and cultural and all sorts of things to try and make remembrance feel more live in British society. And I've often seen our work as similar. It's just weird, instead of course, in addition to people connected to their British lands, who want them to connect to Israel and to how Israelis feel. So there are a few things I would say in terms of how that can work. The first is listening to stories, listening to testimony, listening to families who have lost their relatives or loved ones, and not only, I think, critically learning about the end of these people's life, but actually what was their life like before that? What were their hopes and dreams? What were their aspirations? What's normal life in the army like? What are those who remain? What have they gone on to do? A very Israeli thing to do on Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut, is for old members of a unit to come back together, you know, often years later with family and so on, and have their barbecue and kind of reminisce, and there's an unspokenness. And that comes about, of course, through the visceralness of being in the unit. But I wonder whether for our community, we might, by listening to these stories, adopt a little bit of that practice. Another thing which I would suggest is to understand what the connection between these 3 days. So I actually want to just share my screen very, very briefly. There's a cartoon.
David, I think David's able to do that. It's not me.
We tested it before. I can actually do it. So I'm just gonna share. Hopefully this will work.
Go on.
There we go. Hopefully you should be able to see a cartoon.
Yes.
Now, this cartoon, I'll just very briefly describe it. It's by an Israeli cartoonist, newspaper cartoonist called Shai Charka, one of the most well-known and famous cartoonists in Israel. He is the main cartoonist for an Israeli newspaper called Makor Rishon. And he published this a few years ago, and it's as close as I can pictorially come to understand the connection between these 3 days as a non-Israeli. So obviously, like Hebrew or like in Israel, we read from right to left. And you can see in the one hand, it's 3 days, Yom HaShoah at the right, Yom HaZikaron in the middle, and Yom HaTzmaut on the left. But it's also three, it's the period of the 1940s. So the darkness of the early 1940s with the murder of 1/3 of our people in the Shoah and the Holocaust. Then, this acceleration, this remarkable acceleration towards independence, and the idea, that famous poem by Natan Alterman, that this wasn't given to us on a golden platter, that we had to fight for it, that it wasn't a guaranteed thing. And then 1948 and through to today and beyond, of course, the tracks don't end. This amazing triumph that is Israel and the joy that we have from it. But it's only by having been on the straight bit of track and the downwards, the way your stomach falls out if you're in the roller coaster, that you can truly appreciate the Yom HaAtzmaut. You can truly appreciate independence at the end.
I think that's a great cartoon. It's really something.
Yeah, so I often use that with groups. By the way, non-Jews as well. I've taught this kind of thing to non-Jews, and it's hard for them to understand, just as it is for Jews. And that's as close as I've ever come to understanding kind of what the connection between these 3 days are. Because I would imagine that most people watching this are aware of some of the formalities, some of the ritual of these days, the sirens going off, and people standing at attention, and the barbecues on Yom HaAtzmaut, and the parties and the celebration. But that's the kind of that's how the emotion is expressed. But the emotion is really the roller coaster. And I just also want to share one other idea, which is, it might seem a bit abstract, but actually also again helps me to understand, and maybe it will help the people watching, which is a particular place in Israel, in Jerusalem, that I'd imagine almost all of the people, if you've ever been to Israel, you've almost certainly been. You probably don't know what it's called and what it represents. It's a place called Har HaZikaron, literally the Mount of Memory. Now, most people watching this will probably know it as Har Herzl, as the Israeli National Military Cemetery, if you like, the Israeli Arlington. We don't really have an equivalent in the UK, but they are for Arlington. But actually, on this mountain, this Har, there are actually, in some ways, 3 institutions.
Yad Vashem's around the corner.
Yeah, so further down the mountain, the Mount of Memory, is Yad Vashem. And Yad Vashem, again, I would imagine almost everyone watching this will have either heard of it or been. It is Israel's national, and this is very important, it's Israel's national memorial to the Shoah that happens to have a museum in it. We often think of it as a museum with some memorials around it. It's not. It's a memorial that happens to contain a museum. And that's important because the whole mountain is called the Mount of Memory. And it's low down. It's the lowest down structure on the mountain topographically. And it's like as we scale the mountain, it's the lowest, the darkest, the most awful moment of certainly of our recent history. Then higher up the mountain, and actually from the car park of Yad Vashem, you can walk up a thing called the Connecting Path, which, by the way, was laid out by graduates or people on their youth movement gap year a few years ago. There's boards that tell you this. And on that path, if you walk up it, doesn't take very long. It's about 5 minutes walk. There are boards that show this journey from 1945 to 1948. And at the top of that particular path, you enter the grounds of Har Herzl. And Har Herzl, again, we often think of it as one cemetery, but really it's 2. The further down and around the mountain is the military cemetery. And if you like, that is Yom HaZikaron. That is the sacrifice and the sadness and the bravery and courage that went into fighting for Israel. As we ascended the mountain out of the depths of Yad Vashem, out of Yom HaShoah, we come first to pause and mark our respect for the soldiers. And then at the top of the mountain is the second element of, again, what everyone thinks of as Har Herzl, but the second bit of it, the cemetery for the leaders of the nation. So many of them are graves of Israeli politicians and people from the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, that kind of thing. Many of the great mostly men, but also some women, who are the founders and leaders of Israel and of Zionism. And at the very top, a single grave at the top of the mountain, at the top of Har HaZikaron, not unintentionally, is Herzl. For Herzl represents, in some sense, the pinnacle of memory, the vision of what an Israel could be, of Zionism as fulfilled. Because, of course, Herzl wasn't originally buried there. He was originally buried in Europe because he died in 1904, long before the state. And he's brought and placed at the top of Har HaZikaron. So again, it's just, it's a completely new way to see what many of the people watching this will have seen. Go back again and go to Yad Vashem, walk up the connecting path, explore the military cemetery of Har Herzl, and then go to the leaders of the nation and finally to Herzl. And much like as we walk from last Wednesday night, Thursday, Yom HaShoah, to this Wednesday night, Thursday, Yom HaTzmaut, you yourself can do it in Israel, please God, when we can all go there.
It's amazing to think of that, because I used to live around the corner. I was in the yeshiva there in Beit Vagan, so I don't know if you know the geography over there. So it was literally, I passed Har Herzl hundreds of times in the years that I lived. For 3 years up in Beit Vagan, I passed it hundreds of times, and I've been to Yad Vashem a few times, and I've been also to the military cemetery, but I never realized there was this ascent that goes Yad Vashem, military cemetery, Herzl at the top. So is this something that youth nowadays connect with? Do you find that the youth in the UK or around the world still has that same burning sense for the Zionism that used to be? I often speak to David Mintz about it, and David Mintz said, you know, when we were a fledgling state, when people looked, and this might be part of the discussion we're going to have soon with the UAE as well, when we were, this fledgling state, and then we had no army and we had no weapons, and people literally would be willing to sell their jewelry just to give somebody a gun in Israel, just to give somebody and when the 6-Day War broke out, the Yom Kippur War broke out, people sat and listened through Yom Kippur. They sat and listened to the radio. This was really, really scary for them. It was such a precarious situation. Whereas today we look at Israel. I went to Israel last year, just before the Corona epidemic hit. And my sister actually works at Facebook Israel. She's a very, very high up executive at Facebook Israel, and globally, actually. She showed me the chart. She's only 5 or 6 rungs away from Mark Zuckerberg. So it's Mark Zuckerberg, and there's a few people below. Like, she showed me the chart. She's like that high up. And Facebook Israel is in this massive tower in Tel Aviv, 40 floors up, and you look around and you see this huge, Tel Aviv around you, and this master of high tech, et cetera, et cetera. Israel is not anymore this, if we were to call it, again, I'm saying it in a way, but just to let you understand what I meant, it's not this Nebuch state anymore.
No,
Israel is a very, very successful economy, country, army, et cetera, et cetera. And you feel maybe that today's youth don't buy into that anymore, this, Israel and the importance of Israel anymore, because they don't see it as disadvantaged as it used to be.
So
especially from the UJIA perspective.
Well, so this is a question we think about all the time. I think clearly the relationship to Israel, by the way, for some adults as well, but if we're going to primarily, the conversation is about the next generation. Of course, the relationship has changed. Israel has different needs of us as well. Like that, it doesn't help Israel if we were to gather socks and send them so they could, put socks on new immigrants. Like, that's not a need that Israel has. And yet, exactly as you point out, Israel's spectacular success presents challenges for those of us who care about the connection. I mean, just to give you 3 examples of Israel's success. When Israel was founded, when David Ben-Gurion stood up in Tel Aviv and declared independence on the 14th of May, 1948, 73 years ago on Thursday, or in the Hebrew date at least, about 6% of world Jewry, 1 in 16 Jews in the world, lived in the land of Israel. Okay, it was a small community, an amazing community that achieved an enormous amount in the previous century, but still it was a small community, about 600,000 Jews. That's roughly 2 British Jewries, or if you like, half a New York. Today, Israel is, depending on how you count, 45%, maybe 46% of world Jewry, almost half. And at some point, probably in the late 2020s or early 2030s, Israel will become the majority of the Jews of the world. So just demographically, Israel has been a stunning success from the perspective of providing a safe and secure place for Jews to live and have families and to dream dreams and to normalize, to have like normal lives like we would want Jews to be able to have. Already a majority of Jewish children in the world are born in Israel. So that's one example. And therefore, the idea of Israel as the tiny cousin that needs desperate support when it only has 6% of world Jewry just doesn't, it's just not true. It would just be disingenuous to pretend. It's actually, again, depending on how you count, and counting Jews is hard, but it is either the largest or the second largest Jewish community in the world. A second way is, as you said, economically. You know, when Israel was founded, it had enormous economic challenges. It didn't have many natural resources. It had something of an industrial base, but it was hardly an industrial powerhouse. It had an enormous defense budget that it needed to pay for, obviously because it faced existential threats, and we'll come on to that in a minute. And it had an influx of refugees. Within basically 5 years of the state being founded, the population tripled by people arriving, Holocaust survivors, Mizrahim, Jews from Arab-speaking and Muslim-majority countries, and others. You know, this idea of kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles, which is an incredibly powerful idea. And I have to say, is one of the things that I love about Israel, is this idea that Jews from around the world have come and made, and non-Jews, by the way, but have made this kind of melting pot that makes Israeliness. That presents just on the ground huge problems, like they need houses and they need jobs and all this kind of thing. And so the idea of an impoverished Israel, the idea of an Israel that needed the diaspora, the quote unquote, the rich diaspora, to fund some of the very basic, you know, schools and park benches and this kind of thing, that was real. Now, Israel still faces enormous economic challenges, by the way, including exacerbated by Corona. And the next few years are going to be very hard as the Corona pandemic unwinds in Israel, in the particular way that Israel's done unemployment. I won't go into all the details. Like it's been, they haven't exactly.
Israel is based, I mean, a lot of it is based on hospitality. In Israel, as you go around Israel, you know, when hospitality shuts down, you feel like a quarter to a third of the economy shuts down.
Well, very, very briefly, this is not an economics talk, but Israel faces at least three particular challenges. One is what you just said, tourism, hospitality. The second is it's an export-led economy. And if the rest of the world is in recession, Israel's really going to suffer. And the third is that Israel has enormous levels of inequality, income inequality, which will probably be exacerbated by the pandemic. So yes, Israel has major challenges, and our job at UJIA, one of our jobs, is to explain to Jews there are still these needs, but you have to be strategic about them. And again, I'm not really in the business of slagging off other Israel causes, whatever, like that's not really my style or UJIA's style. But clearly there are some causes in Israel that are deeply needed at the moment, and a partnership between Israel and the diaspora is needed, but others where they're just not. Like Israel is a modern Western economy. And just the third way I was going to say Israel has been a stunning success, of course, is in terms of its own defense. Israel, thank God, and obviously has not been overwhelmed. They did not push us into the sea in the 50s and 60s and 70s. The rocket threat and suicide bombings remain obviously a terrible dilemma for Israel and a problem, but they're not existential threats. At least they haven't been so far. The IDF is, again, and military intelligence, thank goodness, are able to counter them. And even Iran, which is potentially an existential threat if they were to get a bomb and, you know, do what they say that they, at least in theory, might do. Just today in the news, there was Israel will neither confirm nor deny, but it looks like Israel has done some damage to the Iranian nuclear program. So that doesn't mean that the army is not necessary. It doesn't mean that Israel doesn't face enormous threats regionally. But considering where it was in 1948, where Egypt, Jordan, all of the Arab states were all declared enemies of Israel and sent armies, today, all of those, there is peace. Lebanon, there is no peace, but it's a little bit quieter, we'll see, with Hezbollah. Although Hezbollah has been terribly damaged by the Beirut explosion, by fighting to try and keep Assad in power in Syria and all sorts of other things. Hamas is thankfully rather pinned down in Gaza, and although they make the life of Gazans miserable and kind of sometimes fire rockets sometimes, it's nowhere near what it was. And in the West Bank, it's it's a complicated situation. Many, of course, the Palestinians are not particularly happy with Israeli presence. But in terms of day-to-day violence, there is violence, sometimes against Israelis, sometimes against Palestinians, and we shouldn't minimize on either side. Those are terrible tragedies. But we are a long way from the dark days of suicide bombings, of the IDF being encamped in the major cities in the West Bank. Israel has done an incredible job in a very difficult neighborhood of securing itself and providing security for its citizens, which I suppose makes Yom HaZikaron all the more poignant, but it also makes sometimes explaining all of that difficult to young people. But actually, my sense is young people do understand, even as they feel conflicted about Israel is powerful now, and that comes with its dilemmas. Young people do understand there's a necessity for an army. There's a necessity for Israel's security. There might be, you can passionately disagree with individual actions and policies of the government, but that's different from disagreeing with the fundamental premise. And my sense is that most young Jews still fundamentally agree with the premise, the basic justice, as I always like to say, of the Zionist cause. And that's something which every generation we have to continue to tell the story and bring it up to date. But I'm confident that this generation and the next will hear it and will relate to it in some way.
That's amazing. That I can see you. A lot of these questions you must have been asked these questions before, because it just rolls off your tongue in such a great way. It's really impressive. I'm just going to point out a comment over here that Phil Morrison has. As far as I know, we have a few boys from the shrubberies in the army and who have finished the army. We have Phil, some of his children. We have some of the Feingolds, and there are others. I'm sorry if I've left you out and I didn't know the names. But, this is something that we can be proud of. And that means that some of our children are actually going on to Israel, and they feel if I make Aliyah, even if I can get the quick pass, many of them says, I don't want the quick pass. I want to do the full 3 years in the army. I don't want the Aliyah experience of only 12 to 18 months in the army, because I get it, I'm going to do the full 3 years, and then afterwards I'm going to do it the way, everybody else does it. And we've had lone soldiers from our community and from other communities here in Manchester that, on their own in Israel, in an army, fighting a battle for a country that they feel is really theirs.
Well, let me say two things. Firstly is, for all of the children and members of the community who are in the army or have finished the army, if you're in the army, I wish them a meaningful and safe service. They've finished the army. Thank you for their commitment to Israel and for their service. This incredible idea of going to another country where you're not a citizen and you don't have to, you could just wait a few more years, but to actually, as you say, volunteer for the army, I think shows an incredible dedication and says a lot about the families and the educational frameworks those people are being brought up in. And just the other thing I would say, it's not specific about Aliyah, but about travel to Israel. At the moment, obviously, we can't travel to Israel. Pretty much the only way that you can do time in Israel at the moment is through Masa, through gap year or post-college programs, yeshiva programs, longer-term ones. Those are pretty much the only ways this year we've been able to send people to Israel. And it breaks my heart that we haven't been able to send more people, but we are where we are. There's a pandemic. Masa numbers this year are the highest we've seen for years, and for next year, they're going to be even higher. There seems to be a resurgence in people, young people who are interested in Israel. And I have to say, part of it is ideology, believing in the values and so on, but it's also that actually, for the first time ever, you don't have a contradiction between my career and my personal development and my ideology and my values. Because actually, you were saying, I think you were saying your sister works at Facebook Israel. Israel has the most unbelievable opportunities for young Jews to intern, to work, to study remotely. There's now a whole section of Masad devoted to people who might want to work remotely from Israel, because now that's going to be a reality in the new normal. Who would have thought? I mean, I think it would have been crazy to Ben Gurion and Begin and the founders of Israel to say 73 years later, after a pandemic, we would be sending young British Jews to Israel so they can work in the UK from Israel and contribute to the society and learn the language and engage in the culture. And, that is just, I think that is a miracle. And it's something we as UJIA are very proud to do in partnership with Masa, to send young Jews, students, gap year students, post-college, yeshiva sem, all the different ways you can go. And if anyone watching this is interested, or their children or grandchildren are, get in touch with my colleague Josh. Google Masa UK, M-A-S-A UK, have a look. There are amazing opportunities to spend time in Israel, even with the pandemic. It's the one way you can go at the moment.
Yeah. No, so that's an amazing thing, and I know a lot of people that have gone, and I'm just going to mention over here the comment that Phil made again. Gideon Werner is going next month, so we wish Gideon and Tzedchen Shalom that should go well, and that please God, you should go in peace, but more importantly, also come back in peace, and that your time in the army is going to be a time that's going to be spent during relative peace rather than during war and during conflict.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
And you said before about how can maybe people engage with Yom HaZikaron. I just want to mention one other thing, which is there is a whole genre, of course, of like soldier testimonies, the testimony or the books about soldiers who fought in the Israeli army, as there is, of course, in every army in the world. And there are a number of ones written by Olim or by Anglos, people that are themselves immigrants from English-speaking countries or their parents were, and often they're in English. There's one by a guy called Mark Goldberg, called Across the Green Line or On the Front Line or something like that, which is very, very interesting, very raw. Doesn't, will tell you the truth of army life. It's not all, heroism and glory. There's a lot of, it's difficult, and being a soldier is hard. And another, which I just read, which came out a few years ago, called Pumpkin Flowers, which is a beautiful book about a particular outpost in Lebanon. As many of the people watching will know, Israel had a permanent presence in southern Lebanon from 1982, the first Lebanon War, all the way up to 2000, for 18 years. And later it became quite controversial within Israel, and there was a famous helicopter crash which killed a large number of Israeli soldiers, and this kind of convinced them that they should perhaps pull out. And this story is the story of different generations of soldiers who were at this particular outpost. The outpost was called Pumpkin in Hebrew, and flowers is the word for casualties. It's like the terminology, the military terminology. And that idea is very, very powerful. I'm really sorry. My buzzer is just going. Someone is buzzing me. It's not going to happen at the moment, but I'm just going to quickly.
You go for it.
Give me 30 seconds.
I'll give you 30 seconds. You go on.
In the
meantime, I'm going to try to find the techiest thing that I had from Ben Shapiro so that I can put that up on my screen as well. Let me see if I can find in the background in my emails. Let's see where we are. Yom HaZikaron. Pull this up. Excellent.
Apologies for that, everyone.
That's fine. Let me just see if I can share something on my screen as well. No, I don't think I can share that. That's all right. Okay. So I'm going to read out the details over here that I have. It's the details are UJIA, join UJIA to remember the fallen soldiers in a moving ceremony with, as you said, Anat Farkash, Colonel Tidhar Dar, and Chief Rabbi Mervis. It does say on the flyer, click here to register, but there will be a website. What's the website for it? Maybe if you can, if David Mintz, if he tells the website, David Mintz can put it on the bottom and people can click on it.
If you just go to UJIA.org, our main website, you'll see as soon as you go in the top right-hand corner, there's a whole thing that says Remembering Together, Yom HaZikaron. So click on that, and then there's a link to register. It's very easy, UJIA.org.
Right. Okay, so I know we were starting to run out of time. I know you need to go in about 10 minutes. It's been an amazing conversation. There's still so much to cover. I guess I want to ask two more questions, and then maybe we'll go with that. Number one, when you were going through the three things that have changed around, you said, even though people think like, Israel's not anymore the Nebuchadnezzar, it's not anymore the brother in need, there's still many areas there are in need. There's still many disadvantaged areas. I know that there are areas, I don't know if there's even this overlap between, I know there's a lot of poverty in the Haredi communities, and I don't know if there's an overlap with that with the UJIA or not. So number one, what is UJIA doing nowadays as projects to help those disadvantaged people? And then looking towards the future, the future of Israel, but really also the future of UJIA. Where do you think we're going to be? Forget about post-corona, because we don't even know that. But give it 5-10 years from now, how will this topography look like? What is it going to look like?
Sure. So in terms of the situation in Israel, what's UJIA doing about it? So the major situation today in Israel is inequality, and that operates on two levels. Number one is there are many communities that are in poverty. Israel has one of the highest levels of poverty, of relative poverty in the OECD, in the developed world. Some of that is structural, some of that is about how the economy is set up. Israel has been an enormous success, and you can see the gleaming towers. That in Israel, you say from Hadera to Gadera, these kind of towns in the north and south of the center of the country, if you just spend all your holiday time there, which are beautiful, it's very easy to think that Israel is like, it's all like Silicon Valley. But if you go north or south of there, and by the way, within the center as well, it's a very different Israel. It's Israel where a lot of the infrastructure is crumbling. It's an Israel where the school system does not prepare young people adequately for, the modern world of work. And it's an Israel where, as you say, many communities, be they Haredi communities, Arab communities, and others, have deep-rooted challenges with employment and opportunity. And UJIA, in a slogan, we turn inequality to opportunity. And how do we do that? A whole range of things that we fund and support in Israel. Some of them educational programs, some of them about employment, some of them about microfinance and loans. Some of them are, for example, we've support a project called Ampersand. Ampersand is like the and sign. But the ampersand is, the idea is a little bit like, imagine WeWork, that kind of cool shared office space where kind of, cool Tel Avivian techies will hang out. Ampersand is that for the Haredi community. So it helps Haredim who need a different culture. They wouldn't feel comfortable walking into some like WeWork on Nachalat Binyamin in Tel Aviv. They need something where they feel that they want to provide for their family. They have great ideas. They can be great business people, but they need the mentorship. They need the physical workspace. They need the access to finance. They need the coaching and support to make it happen. It's just one example. That's a modern.
Where would I find an ampersand, for example? Just interesting. In which area in Israel do they have those?
So the one that we support is in Bnei Brak, which is really? It's a town city right next to Tel Aviv. That's basically a Haredi city.
Yeah, basically, I've been to Bnei Brak a few times. My wife has an uncle that lives there, so it's about as Haredi as it gets. And it borders on Ramat Gan, which borders on Tel Aviv. It's all one big mush almost.
So Rabbi, next time you are in Bnei Brak, give us at UJIA a call. We will take you to Ampersand, and you'll see the amazing work that they do. And that's at the cutting edge. That's what Israel needs. And it's what we in the diaspora can help and partner with in order to help continue the strengthening of Israel and the miracle that is Israel, but making it fit for the 21st century. So that's the kind of thing that UJIA is doing today. In terms of the future, I think that there are two key things that UJIA will do in the future. The first is we will continue, as we always have, connecting British Jews to Israel. That's what we were set up to do. By the way, UJIA is 100 years old this year. 100 years ago in London, and it wasn't called UJIA at the time, but the first large-scale operation to raise money and give active support from the diaspora to Israel was founded in London. One of the original directors of the company, by the way, was Ze'ev Jabotinsky, or Vladimir Jabotinsky, as it says on the original record to Company's House. These were really some of the great figures that we all learned about in school. They were involved in the setting up of UJIA. And really, although the what UJIA has done and the how has changed, the why will not change. We are here. We're an expression of the fact that thousands of ordinary British Jews care about Israel and want to support it, be that through learning about Israel, be that through experiencing and going to Israel, or be that through giving to Israel. So that won't change. That and how we do it might change, but that won't change.
So that's your mission statement, so to speak.
Absolutely. And that's our organizational DNA. Just like a shul, has always been the Beit Knesset, the Beit Tefillah, the Beit Midrash, all rolled into one. But shuls have looked and felt and sounded different over the generations, but their DNA remains.
Absolutely. It's a great analogy. Love it.
And the same for UJIA. That's the UK side. In Israel, we will continue to double down on understanding Israel's actual needs, not just what we imagine them to be, but being in dialogue with Israelis and Israeli society, looking at how we can continue to make a meaningful impact on Israel to make it a fairer and more just place, a strong and stable place, and where it's an economy that's open to everyone and a society that's welcoming to all Israelis. And for me, by the way, that is the great mission of Zionism. 100 years ago, if I'd been the director of strategy of whatever UJIA would have been 100 years ago, clearly the mission of Zionism was to found a state. 50 years ago, clearly the mission of Zionism was to keep that state safe at all costs.
Survive.
Today, obviously, the state has been founded, and Israel does need to be kept safe, but Israel does a very good job of keeping itself safe. Our job now is to help strengthen the society, to make the Israeli society a model society for all others in the world, such that it can be a place where, as I said, from inequality comes opportunity, where all Israelis can live the life that they deserve in a modern, democratic Jewish state as Israel is. So I think that in some senses, UJIA will change dramatically after the pandemic, and when we can all go and we'll send more young people and more all this kind of thing. But actually, I want to say, in some senses, we're not changing at all, because our role of connecting British Jews remains, and our role of strengthening the society in Israel is, is very, very powerful, and is, for me as a Zionist, I have to say, is what makes me very proud to have worked at UJIA now for almost 10 years.
So last question. Do you guys at UJIA, do you promote Aliyah? And personally, are you hoping one day to make Aliyah?
So we don't promote Aliyah in the sense of saying it is the aim of all British Jews or all Jews should be to live in Israel. If people want to make Aliyah, that is a great, for their own personal reasons, that's brilliant. And we are supportive of that. And in Israel, we support Olim, and many of our staff are themselves Olim, or indeed Israelis who are living in the UK. So we promote Aliyah to the extent that we ask young people to consider it as a life option, but it works for some people and it doesn't for others. We're also an integral part of the community here, and Anglo Jewry is an amazing, I'm very proud to be a British Jew, by the way. I think there's great stuff in the British Jewish community. So maybe promote is the wrong word, but we celebrate Aliyah when it happens. Me personally, I actually think Aliyah has changed. There was a time when Aliyah meant rip up the passport, get on the boat, and goodbye to the old country, and I'm here in the new. I would love to spend more time. I'd like to spend a significant portion of my life, like you have, 9 years, like a period of my life in Israel. It's a wonderful place, and it's one of the places I feel really at home. I'm not sure I'm going to make Aliyah live there for the whole of my life, but who knows? It depends where my life takes me in the next few years and beyond. But I would definitely hope to spend more time in Israel, because I love the time that I get to spend in Israel. And it's, on a personal level, been one of the great sadnesses for me of the pandemic, is that it's now been basically a year and a half since I was in Israel. I hope it's not another year and a half before I can go.
Okay, so thank you so much, Robin. It's been really, as Sharon said, it's been a great presentation. Really, really appreciate the fact that you gave up of your time, that you're willing to come and to join us to speak about the UJIA, to speak about your own experiences, what the UJIA is doing, the past, the present, and the future. And, if anybody who wants to get involved, again, please have a look at the website. It's coming across the bottom, ujia.org. There's all the information, as we spoke about, for the Tekes, for Yom Ha'atzmaut, as well as, Yom Ha'atzmaut with the business breakfast. Be really interesting to hear about the Abraham Accords between the UAE and between Israel. You can also see the Tekes, as we spoke about, on Tuesday night. It's going to be up there, as well as many different stories, other things that you can show your children to be inspired. I'm sure there's many great things on YouTube as well as the Massa organization. If you do want to send people to Israel pre or post gap year or something like that, university, the UJIA will help you, and the UJIA will point you in the right direction. Thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you, David, for hosting it and running it in the background. And, Roman, good luck with everything that you're doing, and you should have a Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach.
I was exactly what I was going to say. I hope that people really reflect and have a meaningful Yom HaZikaron, and then have a bit of a party. Find a way to celebrate even at home. Chag Atzmaut Sameach, and happy 73rd birthday, Israel.
Happy birthday. All the best.
Very good.